Did I hear you're shopping for a car? Because I've been at it for ages. Ugh, such a time suck, right?
Not really. I bought it on Carvana. Super convenient.
Oh, then comes all the financing, research. Am I right?
Well, you can, but I got pre-qualified for a Carvana auto loan in like 2 minutes.
Yeah, but then all the number crunching and terms, right?
Nope. I saw real numbers as I shopped, found my dream car, and got it in a couple of days.
Wait, like you already have it?
Yep.
Oh.
Go to Carvana.com to finance your car the convenient way.
Selling a little or a lot? Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your own online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit 1 million orders stage. Shopify's there to help you grow. Shopify helps you turn browsers into buyers with the internet's best converting checkout. 36% better on average compared to the other leading commerce platforms. Because businesses that grow, grow with Shopify. Get a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/promo. Shopify.com/promo.
Hello and welcome to The Price of Football, the show that looks at the money behind the beautiful game with me, Kevin Day, and Liverpool University's Kieran Maguire. Or Kieran, should I say, howdy, and welcome to The Price of Football, because to avoid confusion for our dear listeners, Kieran and I are in different time zones. Yet again, where are you at the moment, Kieran, on your international James Bond accountancy life?
I'm in the wonderful city of Charlotte in North Carolina for a few days of this, that, and none of the other. So we're recording this on the Sunday. So it's an interesting day to be in the United States because it's just a few hours after Joe Biden has said that he's not going to take on Ronald Reagan in the next election and he's withdrawn.
Yeah, I don't think there was any suggestion, Kieran, that you were going there for the other. We assumed it would just be the this and the that, especially as we both reached an age when the other is a long forgotten memory for the most part, Kieran, isn't it? But yes, you're in a town of history on a day that history is being made. And you say it's Sunday, it's nearly Monday for some of us, Kieran, who've stayed up till nearly 9:30. I've stayed up till... I did a very long interview for Radio New Zealand on Friday night, which I had to start.
Did you?
Yeah, and I was very pleased to confuse them because I'd been to a friend of mine who was very ill over Christmas. Didn't think he'd make it till next Christmas, so decided he was going to have a Christmas party last Friday. And then, God bless, the NHS got him better, and he decided he'd have the Christmas party anyway. So I thought I'd be really clever, and I said to this bloke at Radio New Zealand, I've just come from a Christmas party in a heat wave, which, of course, is what they do every year. So they were completely bemused by that fact. Although I was very disciplined and only had one glass of eggnog, which at 95-degree heat, Kieran, even I wouldn't recommend it. It's questions day, but we do have a big news story first, and it involves Everton, Kieran. And I have to say, when this story broke, you seemed to be a rare voice of calm in a sea of social media panic from journalists and Everton fans.
Yes, the reason why and I did interviews for 5 Live, Sky, TalkSport and Radio Merseyside. I was trying to do what I believe was the role of civil servants when addressing Gordon Brown, which was to create a poo sandwich, which is you start off with a bit of good news, then you put in all of the bad stuff, and then at the end you say, well, we'll have another little bit slice of good news. So I guess I'll try to do that. I don't want it to be all doom and gloom, but I've got to be said, here the negatives are far greater than the positives. So what has happened is that the Friedkin Group, who were the second set of preferred bidders in respect of acquiring Everton Football Club, in particular acquiring the 94% of shares owned by Farhad Moshiri, they formally withdrew from the process on Friday. Now, I've got to be honest, this story had been leaked on Tuesday/Wednesday to certain parties, but not the football club itself. This is how bad things were, that some people were aware that the deal had collapsed, but Everton hadn't realised that themselves. So I think that's indicative of just how bad things were between Farhad Moshiri and Friedkin Group. Now, the good news is that Friedkin were initially very positive about the deal. And on the back of that, they've lent Everton Football Club £200 million. That's allowed Everton to pay off one of their existing significant loans. That was to MSP Capital, and has left a little bit of money over in terms of paying the day-to-day bills, also helping the club to be able to reach its commitments with regards to the stadium in the short term. So that's the good bit. The bad bit was, well, why have the Friedkin Group pulled out? And they already own Roma. They are used to dealing with complex deals. Friedkin himself is a very successful and very wealthy man. And sadly, it comes back to 777 partners. And also, I think Farhad Moshiri has to take a large slice of the responsibility here as well. 777 are owed around about £200 million. And when they effectively dropped out of the bidding, their loan was not due for repayment. And also they are the junior lender. So therefore they cannot be repaid until there's another lender called, it all gets very complicated, there's another lender called Rights and Media Funding, who are the most senior lender. Rights and Media Funding themselves are a curiosity because this is a company which is based in Cheshire, which has no employees, and yet has a loan book of over £300 million. And when you go into Rights and Media Funding's accounts, which a few of us have a habit of doing, they seem to have borrowed money from that paragon of transparency, the Bahamas. So some money's come from the Bahamas, has gone to a company which has no employees, which has then lent the money to Everton. So they've got first dibs, I think that's a technical phrase, on about £200 million from Everton. Then it looks like the Friedkin Group are second. Friedkin, their loan doesn't have to be repaid for another 12 months. Then we've got this issue with 777. And the problem with 777 is they are having their arse sued off by a number of people. And we've discussed the reason why. The accusation is that 777 have borrowed money effectively under false pretenses. That could lead to lawsuits in the US. So under normal circumstances, I think Friedkin were going to go to 777 and say, look, you're not going to get your money back. How about we offer you 60%, 50% of what you're owed? And if you don't want it, then you're going to have to go and wait an awfully long time. If there's going to be potential lawsuits around, it could be that the US government or the litigants in those lawsuits will say, well, hold on, that money is something to do with us. So therefore, you can't sign a deal with 777 because it might not be in our best interests. So there's a large complication there. And what's happened is that Friedkin's lawyers have said, walk away. You don't know what you're letting yourself in for. If you try to get indemnities from Farhad Moshiri, well, they're pretty worthless because for all we know, he's skin. And nobody seems to know how much Farhad Moshiri's got. So there's that as one issue. Secondly, I think Moshiri seemed to think that his shares were worth something. He's been looking for 50 million quid because, again, some people seem to think he's skin and therefore he needs every penny he can get hold of. Since his friend Alisha Usmanov was declared persona non grata in the UK, the money coming from Moshiri to Everton seemed to have dried up. The problem is that the shares aren't worth 50 million quid in all probability. They're probably worth £1. If I was Moshiri and somebody offered me £1 and I could walk away from Everton, I'd probably snap their hand off. But if I've got no money, then there's a further complication. So I think Friedkin said, we're going to Herriting Club with a load of debt and potentially some lawsuits. We've got somebody wanting 50 million quid for shares that we don't think are worth 50 million quid. Why put ourselves through this? So that's the position. On top of that, whilst Everton have got some cash in because it looks like they're selling Onana to Villa, so they get 50 million quid there. They've sold Ben Godfrey. They've sold 1 or 2 other players. So they've got a bit of cash which has come in, which is all good. There's still the ongoing work taking place on the stadium. Matt Slater, our good friend, he reckons there's probably 70 to 80 million pounds of outstanding fees in terms of finishing off the stadium. That money's got to come from somewhere. So that adds on to the plate. So that's where we are at present. The deal was just too complicated and looking too expensive for Friedkin to want to take on. Who does this leave as potential owners? There is an offer of around about £400 million from somebody in London, but that's for everything. And there's £400 million for a club that's got debts of £600 million. Those numbers don't add up. John Textor, could he put in an appearance again? Well, potentially, but there's no sign of him selling his interest in Palace. So that's going to be complicated and that's going to be long-winded. And again, if I was a lawyer advising him, I'd say, well, you sure you know what you're walking into here? And there could be other potential interested parties who are probably sitting on their hands at present because they might feel that they don't want to inherit any of this and they'd perhaps like to just go and buy the assets of the club off a potential administrator. Now, that's a long way off. I'm not suggesting we're anywhere near that at present, but it's complicated, it's messy, and it's not good news. Everton have got enough money to pay this month's wage bill, to pay next month's wage bill, and so on. But once we get into sort of towards the end of the year, you're not quite sure how good things are going to be.
I'm going to try and make that slightly more uncomplicated, Kieran, for Everton fans who have a similar grasp on finances that I have. Just to prepare you for that, I will tell you that Gordon Brown, while he was Chancellor, came to see one of my Edinburgh shows, which is all very exciting, and then suggested afterwards that perhaps I'd like to go for a drink with him in Edinburgh after, which is less exciting than I thought it might be, Kieran. Cut to me, Gordon Brown, and two blokes, obviously from Secret Services, having half a dry sherry each while we discussed, not even my show, discussed economics, which is, you don't do that to a comedian, Kieran, after they've come off stage, especially to one with no economic knowledge, which brings me back to my point. So I suppose there's a certain irony when you've got Moshiri, whose lack of communication has for some years been an issue with you, being one of the last people to find out that the Friedkin Group were pulling out. I'm just trying to find ways of reassuring Everton fans. So I suppose it's some good news for them that this is a sort of complicated, you gave it to me to give to him type thing, rather than any potential problem with the club itself. Friedkin hasn't found out that there are systemic problems at the club, that the ground isn't going to be built or that money isn't going to be paid. So these are technical reasons rather than football reasons. Would you say that's the case? This £200 million that Friedkin lent them now obviously has to be paid back. So does that leave Moshiri in a worse state than it was before, or has that paid off some money? I'm just confused where the money's being moved around to, essentially. But obviously the big question is, and you've hinted at it, where does it leave Everton in the short term? I mean, clearly the broadcasting money is due from Sky and the BBC soon. That will help. But if John Textor's not an idiot, he's clearly a sensible businessman. So if people like Friedkin are pulling out, it seems hard to believe that other sensible business people wouldn't do the same thing.
Yeah, ultimately it comes down to price and it comes down to people being realistic. I don't think Moshiri's being realistic. By all means, give him £1 and say that if Everton qualify for Europe in the next 3 to 5 years, there's some extra money available for him. I think I've seen a report in one of the papers, or one of the reporters throughout today, and we're recording this on Sunday, that it'll now accept £25 million plus £25 million in add-ons. I still think that's ambitious in terms of what Everton's worth.
Sorry, Kieran, £25 million?
Yes, there was. I think I saw Matt Hughes, who's one of the reporters. But I'd heard Moshiri was looking for 50 million. Now it seems to be 25. Previously, I'd heard he was looking for 70 or 80.
Okay.
So he seems to move goalposts very, very regularly here. I don't think there's a short-term problem, as you highlighted. Everton have got money from season ticket holders. They've got money from Sky for the start of the season, which has gone to the Premier League, which the Premier League then doles out because that helps to fund the clubs over the course of the summer and also fund the transfer market. And it's got the money from Friedkin, although of that £200 million, a lot of that was just to pay off existing loans.
Right. Okay. That's the bit I really wanted to get clear in my head. This is not a new loan. This is paying off other loans.
Yeah, so it's effectively robbing Peter to pay Paul. So
that's exactly so. Great. Okay, right.
So I think over the course of the next few weeks, Everton are back on the market. I think that people have got to be realistic in their expectations, and this is my reservation: is that 777 have borrowed money from a company called ACAP. It looks like ACAP have been borrowing money at 18% in order to lend to 777. So it makes you wonder how much interest 777 are charging to Everton. 777 can't accept a discount on what's owed to them because that might be deemed to be in breach of a potential, in the US, what they refer to as a Proceeds of Crime Act, because the accusation is that 777 have effectively, is a bit like getting 4 mortgages on the same property and not telling all 4 banks that you're borrowing from. So that's the accusation. 777 deny that, but they're not coming out of this with a lot of grace at present. So I think in the very short term, fine, business as usual. Where does this leave Everton in terms of developments over the summer? Well, the club are saying we've still got the transfer budget as before. We're under no pressure to sell Branthwaite at a discounted price. And we know that Manchester United have put in 2 bids in respect of Branthwaite. If you and I are having this conversation in 5 weeks' time at the end of August, and there's still no new preferred bidder, then things change, because Everton's wage bill is around about 13 to 14 million pounds a month. Goodison on a match day probably brings in no more than 300,000 to 400,000, because the vast majority of Evertonians are season ticket holders. You've probably got 3,000 or 4,000 match day tickets plus 3,000 or 4,000 away tickets sold. You're not actually bringing in a lot of money on a match by match basis. And there's still the ongoing issues that there's money to be paid in respect of the new stadium. So that's when things start to get a bit more complicated. And that's why I'm saying this is not a good situation. It's not panic now, but it could be more concerning if we don't make progress in finding a new bidder. You've got a bit of leeway, but the sands of time are dripping out of that egg timer.
I'm finding it hard to imagine it being a bit more complicated, Kieran, to be perfectly honest. I mean, just to sum up, it must be incredibly frustrating for Everton fans to realise that 777 is still part of the problem and not the solution. And also, despite what the club say, it's almost impossible to believe that they won't be more of a selling club than a buying club in this close season, which would indicate that they'll probably be towards the same end of the table they were in the last 2 seasons, which again makes them slightly less attractive to a new buyer. You guys, they're always going to be a Premier League team with a great history, so maybe that's not the case. But as you say, these are slightly worrying times, and we thought that we almost officially reported that Everton were back in the good books. But we need to get on to questions, Kieran, because we have got some crackers as always. Our first one, I suspect we're going to be getting more and more Saudi Pro League questions as the months roll by. But our first one, Kieran, comes from Stuart Dawalda. Apologies, Stuart, if I didn't pronounce that correctly. You'll be in good company. There's at least 2 a show that I can't. But Stuart says, with all the big name players in the Saudi Pro League, is it possible now to work out approximately how the total Saudi Pro League transfer fee and wage bill last season compared to those in the Premier League last season?
Unfortunately, it's not, Stuart. There isn't the equivalent of Companies House in Saudi Arabia. There are lots of rumours with regards to how much players are paid. You know, Cristiano Ronaldo is estimated to be on something like £150 million a year from some sources. We've got the likes of Benzema and Neymar on huge contracts as well. We've got some managers on huge contracts. But there are, by all accounts, other players in the Saudi Pro League who are much lower profile, who are on the equivalent of a League One or League Two player. What I have done is sort of I've done some analysis, and I think this is not revelatory at all. But if you take a look at the average age of a player in the Saudi Pro League, it's around about 2 years higher than that of a player in the Premier League. So the average age for Saudi Pro League player is 28 compared to 26. Why is that? Well, it is seen, rightly or wrongly, and you or I, we're both enough to remember major soccer in the 1970s when Rodney Marsh and George Best and Pele and all of those players would go across to the United States, effectively not to put on exhibition games, but the standards were not necessarily as high as they were in the domestic leagues, and they still had very unique talents which could be observed. But it was more of a show. We are seeing sort of players. We've mentioned Benzema, Ronaldo, Neymar. There's talk about Kevin De Bruyne going across, Ederson going across. Jordan Henderson went across. So they tend to be players towards the end of their careers rather than the start. And I've always said that I would never criticise a player for doing that, because De Bruyne himself has said, I can earn as much money in 2 years in Saudi Arabia as I have in all of my career to date, and my first commitment's to my family. So we are seeing quite a few players, therefore, sort of signing on Bosman deals because their contracts have expired. At the other end of the scale, some of the transfer fees do appear perhaps be on the generous side, but then there are sort of much broader geopolitical issues perhaps behind connections between some of the Saudi Pro League teams and owners of the clubs that are selling and so on. So it is a very, very complicated situation. So we can't get a definitive answer, I'm afraid, Stuart. Saudi Pro League, I think, as far as this summer is concerned, is as much concerned with renewing contracts of some of the players that have come to the Saudi Pro League and are enjoying their time there as they are for recruiting. But we could still expect some activity over the rest of this summer.
There was an interesting counterintuitive stat, Kieran, that came out towards the end of the Euros about players, high-profile players that were playing their league football in Saudi Arabia, and most pundits and experts were expecting them to struggle for minutes during big games. But it turned out that those players playing Saudi football were actually staying on the pitch longer during the Euro tournament than players that didn't. So the idea that football isn't as intense over there is either not true, or it's just they're just more relaxed and they're not killing themselves playing football every week, so they're getting more minutes on the international pitch. But it was the opposite of what most people expected. Most people were expecting the big name players to be hauled off the pitch after 10 minutes in every game, and it didn't happen.
Want a website with unmatched power, speed, and control? Try Bluehost Cloud, the new web hosting plan from Bluehost, built for WordPress creators by WordPress experts. With 100% uptime, incredible load times, and 24/7 WordPress priority support, your site will be lightning fast with global reach. And with Bluehost Cloud, your sites can handle surges in traffic no matter how big. Plus, you automatically get daily backups and world-class security. Get started now at Bluehost.com.
Well, we got a minute. I'm going to buy that truck I've been wanting.
Wait, don't you need like weeks to shop for a car?
I don't. Carvana makes it super convenient to find exactly what I want.
Hold up. You're buying a car on your phone? Isn't that more of a laptop thing?
You can shop wherever you want.
I like to do my research, read reviews, compare models. Plus, Carvana has thousands of options. How'd you decide on that truck?
Because I like it.
Oh, that is a great reason.
Go to Carvana.com to sell your car the convenient way.
Our next question, Kieran, brings us to Scotland, where we're always happy to go, and it comes from Rowan Perrior. Rowan says, I was wondering what the impact on finances was as a result of the decision the other Scottish clubs took to prevent the post-liquidation Rangers taking their place back in the Scottish Premier League, both in the negative for SPL clubs and positive for those in the second to fourth divisions as Rangers climbed their way back up. Surely match day revenue went down in the SPL and up significantly elsewhere. But what about TV deals, and were there any long-term effects still being felt? This is a question I know for a fact, Kieran, is being asked in advance by those people who are assuming that Man City will end up in League Two in several years' time. So you could almost be reading the future, Kieran.
I could indeed. I've managed to get in touch with a secret Scotsman.
Secret Scotsman?
A secret Scotsman, which is very unusual.
Or her. How are we keeping him or her secret?
Yeah, a secret, a very proud Scotsman as well.
There you all are, Kieran.
Now, as far as the TV deals were concerned, because the Rangers situation occurred relatively early into a contract that had been signed by the Scottish football authorities and Sky had to honour the contract because it wasn't a contract to broadcast Celtic and Rangers, it was a contract to Scottish football. So therefore, the value didn't go down. And what we actually saw in the first season that Rangers were relegated, that quite a few other Scottish clubs saw an increase in their matchday revenues because, for example, Dundee United had record season ticket sales because they thought, hold on, we could finish runners-up. So that, there was actually more interest. But then attendances did start to fall, especially in 2014, 2015, when the two big Edinburgh teams, like with Hibs and Hearts and Rangers, all in the second tier of Scottish football. So what actually happened is we've seen a slight switch from the money in the Scottish Premiership towards the lower leagues, and it's still not huge, but the winners of the Championship, for example, they now get around about 12 times as much money compared to the old First Division, and the playoffs in the pyramid system has been changed, which has been a benefit for Scotland, and that's helped in terms of both TV money and match day. I think that the biggest problems in terms of Scottish football is that it had deals with the likes of Setanta, and Setanta went bust, and that meant that Sky became sort of the only kid in town until BT Sports started to get involved. And therefore, I think it's fair to say that the value of the rights have plateaued rather than grown. And that's not necessarily horrendous, because provided you don't compare yourselves all the time to the Premier League, and the Premier League is in a league of its own, the Scottish rights are okay. And also, when you start to look at viewing figures, and it isn't being critical, but Scotland is a country where there is so much focus on the old firm games. You are getting TV viewing figures as low as 20,000 for matches not involving. If you had Dundee versus Kilmarnock or St Johnstone versus Motherwell, they weren't attracting big viewing figures, and therefore Sky and the other broadcasters were saying, well, unless it involves the old firm or however you want to refer to them, we're not particularly interested. So that period of time where the two big Glasgow clubs were not in the same division was a complication. At the same time, it was great for the lower league clubs in Scotland who would have Rangers fans visiting them, and if they weren't familiar with 17th century Irish history before the Rangers fans arrived, they certainly were for a good few hours during match day.
Yeah, a version of 17th century Irish history, Kieran. I'm just going to say something to our listeners now, Kieran, to keep Ali happy, because they will have heard me, I'm sure, pouring for quite some time, which is obviously a very large glass of wine. Ali's asked me to point out to listeners that it might be 7 o'clock in the morning when you're listening to this, but it's actually 10 o'clock at night when I'm recording it. So I'm not drinking a large glass of wine at 7 o'clock in the morning. I don't know why she wanted me to point that out, Kieran. Probably worried about my reputation. To be honest, Kieran, my nerves are shot today, as I indicated to you when we first started to speak. We had a wildlife situation, Kieran, that matched anything you can have down in. So, I mean, you nearly punched a deer, I believe, last time, didn't you? Was that something like that?
Yes.
A deer looked at your phone. I was upstairs this afternoon pottering about, which is a euphemism for trying to have a kip. It's a very hot day, when there was a lot of noise from downstairs, which immediately I thought, oh God, there's a bee. I have married someone and fathered someone who were way too worried about bees, for the size of bees and the harm they could do. And I went downstairs. It wasn't a bee, Kieran, it's a pigeon. The cat, in a fit of energy, which is unusual for her, had chased a pigeon accidentally, and the pigeon went for the nearest escape route, which happened to be our open kitchen door. So I came down, and there's a pigeon sitting on the kitchen sill looking out, and there's on the garden table, there's a cat at the same level looking in, with Ali trying to keep between them. And then to make matters worse for this poor terrified pigeon, on the draining board, not a foot away from the pigeon, was a chicken that was ready to go into the oven.
Oh, right. Okay. Not a live chicken.
Not a live chicken. No, that would have added even more dangers. But clearly the pigeon kept looking at the chicken thinking, these people are tough. This is obviously this is obviously the wrong house to fly into. And then it was looking at Ali. Ed was as far away as he could possibly be, jumping up and down, doing jazz hands, saying, get rid of the pigeon. Ali then really helpfully suggested, I can't believe she actually said this, she said, why don't you get a glass, like a bee? So I said, the only way that would work, darling, I'd have to get a really large saucepan and an LP. And we haven't had an LP in the house since 1992, so that's not going to work. So in the end, big brave hero here, I had to get everybody out, and I had to very calmly and gently, with a tea towel, which we've now burnt, obviously, wrap the little fella up and carry him out in the garden and throw him away. So I'm a hero to my son and my wife. My cat, on the other hand, is not talking to me. This is the first proper bit of hunting she's ever done, and she's decided I took it away. But I still can't get a glass. The idea was I put a glass over the pigeon and then put a postcard underneath it and shoo it out like it was a bee. It's nature red in tooth and claw, Kieran. The sort of thing that happens to you on a daily basis. I imagine as we're speaking, Finley's probably chowing down on a wonky chop and half a pheasant as we speak, isn't it? He's missing Daddy.
And the pigeon successfully flew?
The pigeon successfully flew away, yeah, and there's quite...
Oh, fantastic.
Well, it did turn up again about 10 minutes later with two mates in a show of bravado, which even I wasn't scared of. We did have an unfortunate situation a couple of years ago, Ed and I, and it wasn't down to the cat this time. She was fast as it when a small bird managed to get into a house and was quite distressed, and Ed and I managed to trap it and calm it down and put it in a cardboard box until it came to itself, sort of thing. And it seemed all right, and then we took it outside and re-released it, and it flew straight into the fence, knocked itself out. So we haven't got the best record in this house, but I just thought I'd let you know, Kieran. That's why I poured myself a large glass of wine, because the adrenaline's still flowing, as indeed it does when I'm doing this pod review, Kieran. Anyway, Morgan Knock has our next question. We're still in Scotland, Kieran, with this question. Morgan Knock is a great name. If you were a Welsh boxer, it'd be an even better name, wouldn't it? Morgan Knock. But Morgan Knock is a Livingstone fan, and he says, last season my team Livingstone signed a South African youngster called Afalele Teto from South African Premier League side TS Galaxy. The club reported that Teto had entered the country on a tourist visa, then announced he'd signed a 4-year contract. They applied for a work permit, which was refused because he had no governing body endorsement. Since announcing that work permit news, he's played in reserve games, participated in promotional photo shoots, and appeared all over the club's social media. Are there special rules, though, says Morgan, for footballers, which means they're allowed to enter the UK as a tourist and then actively search for work?
I don't know when Morgan sent in this question, but I think matters have developed since then. There aren't special, if it's a tourist visas, you are restricted as to what you can do. So I believe Livingstone were due to pay his wages for 4 years. Their attempt to get a governing body endorsement application signed off has failed. A GBE is linked across a series of criteria. The league that you've come from, the number of international caps you've had, the wages that you were being offered, and so on. Unfortunately, I believe that Livingstone's cunning plan was to allow Afalele Teto to get some caps for the South African under-23 team. And on the basis of that, because you've got international caps, then that gives you a certain number of points, which potentially would have assisted him in terms of being able to go and play for Livingstone. There's a problem, however, because South Africa under-23 team has not played since March 2023, which means that he can't get caps. And therefore, on the back of that, what Livingstone have had to do is to acknowledge that his tourist visa has now expired. He can't get a works visa. And he's therefore returned to South Africa on loan to play for the one and only Chippa United, who I think finished 14th in South African division last season. So it's a shame for the young man. A chance to play in Livingstone has been lost. I think it does show the complicated set of rules that we have, and there are rules for a reason, and we absolutely understand that. But whether the club is still having to pay his salary, or whether there was a clause in the small print of the contract that he signed along the lines that they would only pay the salary conditionally upon being able to give him a work permit, we have to wait and find out. But from what I can make out, he is still formally a Livingstone player, even though he can't play for Livingstone.
Is this one of those situations, Kieran, if Livingstone were part of a multi-club model and say Man City and Club Bruges were others, is this one of those situations where he could go to Club Bruges for a season to get his, or has Brexit put pay to that?
No. I mean that could potentially have worked, because if he'd played in Europe, and it could be deemed that what happens, I think under a GBE, it divides the leagues of the world into 4 tiers. And it could be that South African football, which is not going through a good period at present, is probably in the bottom tier. If he goes to play elsewhere in Europe, which could be a tier 1 or a tier 2 league, that would give him additional GBE points, which he could then use to transfer to Scotland as part of an MCO. But I don't think we're in that situation with regards to Livingstone.
Okay. Miles Zeller has our next question. Miles Zeller's question is one thing I've often wondered about is what measures are in place to prevent a sponsor who is unaffiliated with a team or league from acting as a third-party influencer to draw a player to another club. For instance, what if a certain company whose owner is a massive Spurs fan wanted Spurs to sign a player, but the team had already maxed out their wage budget for that year? What's to stop this company from secretly saying they will offer him a massive sponsorship, far greater than market value, to appear in commercials or whatever, and in turn subsidising the team's inability to pay him his expected salary? The word secretly gives it away there, that even Miles thinks this might be slightly dodgy, this suggestion. But is this a kind of a Tevez Mascherano situation where it would count as third-party ownership?
Well, it wouldn't be ownership, because ownership means that one of the parties has a potential reward from a transfer of the player. But these type of parallel contracts are intriguing, because we've seen, for example, the likes of Lionel Messi. He signed a deal to be an ambassador for the Saudi World Cup, which is taking place. He's getting about £120 million a year for that. And similarly, I think there was some ambassadorial contracts being signed in other World Cups, which was significantly beneficial. And you could say, well, perhaps there were links between the parties involved. I know some players playing for National League teams who are on, and I always sort of refer to The Sopranos here, because one of my favourite episodes of The Sopranos was when Tony and the rest of the gang from the Bada Bing, they'd turn up on a construction site for no-show jobs, and they'd just be sitting around, chewing the fat, and then they'd get their payoff from the employer. So I'm aware of players who have done that. I think what Miles has said is perfectly intriguing. The trouble is what happens if somebody goes and snitches on the player, or if somebody hacks into something. I think an interesting case would be the alleged contract that Roberto Mancini had in Abu Dhabi for doing 4 days of coaching a year, which by all accounts earned him as much money as he was earning from Manchester City for a full year's salary. And clearly, there was potential for links between the two parties. So there is nothing illegal about signing a contract for your image rights or for promotional activities, which can earn the player an awful lot of money. I think the football authorities would take a dim view of it, but proving it, especially if, as Miles has said, it happens to be from a fan. Let's say that you won the lottery and you decided that you were going to, via the price of football, you were going to sponsor a player at Palace to stay, and you were going to give him £5 million a year because you just won £200 million on the lottery. Nothing wrong with that. Palace get better off, the player stays, you're happy, everyone's a winner. How the football authorities would react to that, it's an intriguing one, because you're not related to Steve Parish. You've got no shares in Palace. Your only position is as an investor, is an emotional investment from the fact that you supported them from cradle to grave.
Hang on, I'm just going to write down the first lines of a 5-minute routine about me being related to Steve Parish. That'd be what an addition of who do you think you are? That would be, if that turned out to be the answer. Where would that turn up in? If I were to buy a player from, say I was, Conor Gallagher was to come to Palace because I was secretly paying him a huge amount of sponsorship money, how would that show up in the account? It wouldn't show up in the accounts, obviously, but are an individual player's wages itemised in accounts, or is it just the general, you would hide it in a general wage bill figure?
Well, every contract has to be submitted to the Premier League. So therefore, Conor Gallagher's nominal wage that he was being paid, let's say that he was looking for £200 a week, and the club says, well, we're willing to pay him 80 and you're putting him in the other 120. So he signs a contract with Kevin Day Productions Limited or Kevin Day Price of Football Limited. You pay him 120 grand a week. That money would appear in his tax return, but there's no reason, the Premier League's not entitled to see the tax returns of individuals. So it would have to be that somebody grasses him up or hacks into a series of emails, or one of his relatives or friends who he's told the story to grasses him up in order to make a bit of money from the tabloids. But there's no reason why, if everybody keeps stum, I'm a great believer in what goes on tour stays on tour, having roomed with the Prowler, and those tales can never be told.
Oh, it's South London, Kieran. Everyone keeps stum. We know that. No one's going to be not keeping stum. On the other hand, if I'm coughing up all that much money for Conor Gallagher, I ain't doing it under my real name either. It'll be the Premier League. And there's someone called Uncle Terry seems to be paying Conor Gallagher quite a lot of money.
Okay, you can do this.
I know. Carvana makes it so convenient to sell your car. It's just hard to let go. My car and I have been through so much together.
But look, you already have a great offer from Carvana. That was fast.
Well, I know my license plate and VIN by heart, and those questions were easy.
You're almost there. Now to just accept the offer and schedule a pickup or drop-off.
How'd you do it? How are you so strong in letting go of your car?
Well, I already made up my mind, and Carvana's so easy.
Yeah, true. And sold.
Go to Carvana.com to sell your car the convenient way.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Emlyn Riley has our pre-penultimate question, as I like to put it. An interesting one again, Kieran. Emlyn says it's been nearly 20 years since the EU's monopoly case against Sky. The aim of this was to introduce competition, thus driving down prices for the consumer. Did this ruling have the EU's desired results? And if not, has there been unexpected beneficiaries?
This is an intriguing one. For people not familiar with the situation, in 2005, the EU was concerned about monopoly power. And one of the things about being a monopoly is you're allowed to dictate prices, and people have no alternative. As a result of that, and you mentioned Gordon Brown earlier, and what Gordon Brown did, he was the Chancellor at the time, and it looked like there was going to be a big fallout between the EU and the Premier League and the broadcasting authorities. But he was sort of involved as a broker on this, and the solution was that instead of the Premier League selling its broadcasting rights to Sky, instead it split them up into 6 packages. And the rule was that one party could not win all 6 packages. So it went to an auction. That auction was organised by one of the firm of accountants. It was very carefully scrutinised. And this allowed other people to come into football. When we've had the likes of BT Sport, and we've had Amazon recently dip their toes in and then disappear. So we've had alternative broadcasters. The unexpected consequences is that as consumers, we've now had to go and buy, if you want to see all of the football, you've had to buy a BT Sports package and an Amazon Prime package and a Sky Sports package, and of course you've got to pay for your TV license as well. Now, has that meant that as a consumer I've ended up paying more than I would have paid originally? I think there is a case for saying that could be deemed to be the case, but we don't know how much money Sky would have charged as a monopoly supplier. Has it allowed other broadcasters to develop their skills in terms of providing for the football market? Yes, it has. Does it mean that as a consumer, if I want to pay less for a smaller package, do I get the benefit of that? Yes, it does. And has it led to the Premier League being able to negotiate more money? I think there's a case for saying that the Premier League has probably been the biggest beneficiary, because Sky's whole strategy in terms of its incredible success as a satellite broadcaster has very much been driven on its ability to deliver the most TV football available to the consumer. So therefore, how does Sky ensure that it continues to do that? Well, what we saw in both 2014, when the value of the broadcast deals went up by 70%, and 2017, was that Sky feared losing some of the packages and therefore paid more and more. So football has benefited in terms of more money going into the Premier League, and as we've seen, that's floating through to as far as player wages. So you could say players are major beneficiaries. But if you're going to increase the payments by the broadcasters by 70%, the broadcaster is going to turn around to us as consumers and say, well, you really going to pay a lot more money for your monthly subscriptions as well. So I think you could argue that one of the consequences of this is that, as punters, we've ended up paying substantially more. Certainly the increase in the cost of subscriptions has vastly outstripped inflation, and it has become a much greater proportion of disposable income than it has been historically.
I'm going to get even more brownie points from Ali tonight, Kieran, because not only did I save a pigeon's life, like some kind of Kes, only the bird lived, but twice you've said Gordon Brown, and neither time did I say texture like sun, because during the election campaign, it drove her up the fucking wall. Because it's never not funny when somebody says Gordon Brown out loud. You have to say texture like sun. you can't leave it hanging. And it's just like when you're listening to at the end of Radio 4 News and they go, in the city, you have to go, there's 1,000 things I want to say to you. Our penultimate question, Kieran, comes from Benjamin Eccles. His question is in regards to buyback clauses and FFP. And Benjamin starts by saying, I'm a Blackburn Rovers fan. Our neighbours up the road had a very active transfer window last year. Now, it took me some time to work out who his neighbours up the road were, Kieran, because there are quite a few in that neck of the woods. But of course, he's talking about Burnley, and like a true football fan, was reluctant to say the name in print. I doff my hat to Benjamin Eccles for that. So our neighbours up the road, Burnley, had a very active transfer window last year, and some of the players they purchased had quite substantial buyback clauses. James Trafford, for example, was acquired for £14 million from Man City, who have a buyback clause of £54 million. Does this play into their hands in regards to FFP, as now they have a guaranteed £40 million profit coming in before Trafford's contract expires in 2027? I wasn't aware of that, Kieran, but it seems a strange way of doing business that you sell somebody for £40 million and you promise that you'll buy them back for 54.
I don't think that's a promise to buy it back. It's an option. Now, there's an option is not the same as a commitment. We certainly have seen a substantial rise in the number of buyback clauses. Real Madrid have been very active with the likes of Carvajal and a few others. I think Morata. I know Aston Villa, they just bought back Cameron Archer from Sheffield United after he went there for a year. And I think the first one was Luther Blissett. Remember when Luther Blissett went to AC Milan? They had a buyback clause which they operated. He didn't have the most successful year. I've met Luther at Vicarage Road, and he's an absolutely fantastic company and a thorough gent as well. So the reason why selling clubs do this is it's an insurance policy. So if James Trafford went on to have a spectacular season at Burnley and his market value increased to 60 or 70 million pounds, Manchester City were effectively insuring, saying, well, we won't ever have to go and pay more than 54. And this is part of sort of a broader long-term strategy that many clubs have. And they tend to be the quite successful clubs, Chelsea, Manchester City, Real Madrid, Aston Villa, clubs which tend to be sort of up the upper echelons of football, who are in a position to be able to effectively use this as a bargaining chip as part of the overall deal. And what they might say, in the case of Manchester City to Burnley, is said, look, we actually want £20 million or no buyback clause, or 14 million, and we'll buy him back, but we're not going to pay back more than 54. And Burnley say, well, okay, we get the player at a cheaper price to begin with, but our potential profits at the end of the deal, should the player go on to be successful, those are going to be lower as well. So it's always part of a much broader issue as far as negotiations and the intricacies of individual clauses that we see in the transfer market. But it is becoming something which is very common. I think Manchester United have started doing this because Manchester United become slightly more active in the selling part of the market with some of their younger players. And also, remember, we had that merry-go-round just before the end of June for those clubs who purely coincidentally were in danger of breaching PSR. I suspect many of those deals have got buyback clauses as well.
That's interesting. The remarkable thing about Luther Blissett, who is, as you say, charming, very gentle gentleman, is it remains so even when he's telling you some of the stories about the way he and other black players were treated back in the day. It's astonishing. Yeah, very nice. I mean, a great player as well. I mean, people joke about that move to Italy, but he was a brilliant footballer. Brilliant. Our last question, Kieran, comes from Paul O'Connor. It's a well-travelled road, Kieran, this question. But I'm happy to ask it again, to be perfectly honest, because every now and again I like to remind myself of some of the price of football basics, if you like, that I need to keep in my head. And this one is regarding parachute payments. And Paul says, my understanding is, of course, they are spread over 3 years. But my question is, said Paul, if a team that's relegated goes straight back up, what happens to the money that was set aside for those payments for the next 2 seasons? Does it go to a central fund or does it go back to the Premier League?
Yeah, it's a very fair question. What we have, and this is an area which I think the Premier League could have dealt with better. We've just seen both Leicester and Southampton return immediately to the Premier League, which means that the £34 million that both clubs would have received this year and £16 million that they would have received in 25-26 will not be directly received by Southampton or Leicester. So that's £100 million. Yeah. And that money goes back to the Premier League. It is not split between the 72 clubs. Now, certainly this is an area which I feel, and I've been sort of one of the few voices who is not completely against parachute payments, but this is a bonus. So, Steve Parish, Tony Bloom, Todd Bowley and co, they're absolutely delighted when clubs bounce back because this season you've got an extra £68 million being saved by the Premier League. You split that between 20 clubs, that's £3.5 million. That's a player's wages for our clubs or half a player's wages for some of their clubs. So it is a benefit which returns to the Premier League. The Premier League says it was our money to begin with in the first place. I think there was always a good case for saying, look, it was money that was effectively designated for clubs outside of the Premier League. Let's show a bit of compassion, let's show a bit of generosity, but has failed to do so. It will be interesting to see how that will be dealt with as far as the potential ongoing negotiations between the Premier League and the EFL, given that we have a new government and the government, as far as the King's Speech is concerned, does seem committed to the independent regulator. And I think one of the statements was a fair flow of distribution between the Premier League and the EFL. Now, that phrase, fair flow, is open to interpretation in a variety of ways.
Do you know what, Kieran, in my naivety there, where you said that money goes back to the Premier League, I thought you were going to want to say, which they then use for good causes. They then use for grassroots football and charity, but they don't. They just give it to each other, basically. They just spread it out amongst the clubs.
I mean, I think it'll be fantastic if the Premier League says, actually, this is going to go to... I think in terms of relatively easy wins, if people knew that the yo-yo clubs were benefiting grassroots football, the opposition and the hostility towards what people perceive as the greed of some of the Premier League clubs would be tempered. But it's a lost opportunity. At the same time, it's a lot of money. £68 million is a good night out.
It is a lot of money, Kieran, but it's money they wouldn't have anyway. And probably
it's windfall.
It's windfall. So as you say, it's one of those where they would lose nothing except gaining good publicity. Because if you've just got this, which I've argued for from the start, this central benefit fund that this windfall money goes into, and then when a club like Bury is in exceptional trouble, you find a way, properly organised, properly administrated. You're not just giving them the money that they need to get out of trouble, but proper grown-ups are distributing this money to help a club like Bury save itself. Bury has to repay that money over a certain amount of time. Who's losing out of that? No one's losing out of that. Clubs like Bury are saved, and people for once have got a good word to say about the Premier League. But no, as you say, it goes to pay another player's wages who will probably sit on the bench for the whole season. And I wish I hadn't answered that question now, Kieran. I've annoyed myself. What time is it with you in America, Kieran? Let's create a little bit of space between me being annoyed and the end of the pod by saying, what's the weather like out there, Kieran? Is it hot?
It's very hot. I went out earlier. And I wondered why I was the only person on the sidewalk. I'm being down with the locals. And then I quickly realised, after about 2 minutes, that it was extremely hot. And I was getting strange looks from people who are going past in their air-conditioned cars. It is 5:10 where I am, so it must be 10:10 at night.
It is 10:10 now, yeah.
Do we get late evening payments?
Yeah. Wouldn't it be lovely if somebody going by in their air-conditioned car just looked at you, did a double take, and was listening to the pod as they went past you? Thank you to everyone who's donated to the pod via our Patreon page. If you'd like to make a small monthly contribution as well, that'd be very kind of you to get you access to our chat community and our regular quizzes. And you can do that by going to patreon.com/priceoffootball. If you have a question you'd like answered on next Tuesday's Questions Pod, email us at questions@priceoffootball.com. Don't forget, you can follow us on Twitter, X, and you can find us on our YouTube channel. And if you'd like to buy our book, or I think we've got a t-shirt left, you can find details on that same website, priceoffootball.com. We'll be back on Thursday with our latest news pod, one of which will be a story based on an angry tweet from a Leeds fan today, so I'm looking forward to that. In the meantime, I shall hand you over to Mr. Kieran Maguire for his customary farewell.
Thank you, as always, for the interaction, for keeping us on our toes, and some very kind words about our Scottish show on a Friday. Just to give you a bit of a heads up, we are having a couple of interviews. One is going to be with Maheta Malango from the Professional Footballers Association. So if you've got any questions for the PFA, we've also got an interview lined up with Neil Doncaster from the SPFL. So again, if you want to send us any questions, if you ask the PFA or ask the SPFL, we'll try to get those through to the relevant guys. Yeah, we're always trying to get a variety of interviewees. We've got an interview coming up, and we arranged this before it's happened. We're going to have a celebratory show on Thursday in respect of our friends of Southend, because it's really good. We've had so many shows, but this is going to be a celebration, and we'll be talking to Southend folks fairly soon, which is something we're so looking forward to. There's a variety of ways you can support the show. If you want to get an ad-free version, you can do that via Patreon. If you want to support the show, however, helps us if you give us a review. Doesn't matter what you say, it's the fact that people are interacting. So you can even say you would rather have the show presented by Joe Biden and Milton Jones.
Ooh.
I think that would be an interestingly confused show, and I'm not quite sure how long it would last.
Actually, Joe Biden is so confused. If he's with Milton Jones, he might go all the way back, and Milton Jones might make perfect sense to Joe Biden. Maybe that would have been a solution to the Democrats' problems all the way along. If they just got Milton Jones to filter Joe Biden's, that would have. Now we're getting very meta now. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
The price of football. The price of football.